You have all these scandals, but no accountability for the CIA being involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and all sorts of scandals over the years. But there's never been any accountability since, there was an effort with it at the, during the Church Committee in the late 70s. But since then, the CIA investigates itself and exonerates itself every time.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to get my head around this. So whilst the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, is meant to be protecting U.S. interests abroad.
Well, they define U.S. interests, I think, as something than what the American public is. So if you look at the CIA's earliest coups, their earliest regime change operations, they were done on behalf of very powerful multinational corporations, like Anglo-American Oil in Iran and the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, some of the earliest examples. So to them, protecting U.S. interests is protecting the interest, not necessarily of the American people, but of massive American-based, multinational corporations.
Stay alert. The intelligence crime network goes deeper than you think. A hidden intelligence crime network is shaping global power far beyond what most people realize. Beneath the surface of governments and institutions lies a vast web connecting intelligence agencies, organized crime groups, billionaires, powerful banks, multinational corporations, and political elites through a system that spans countries and decades. The deeper investigators dig into these connections, the more alarming the pattern becomes, revealing a global structure of power operating quietly in the shadows. And the further you pull the thread, the more you realize this is not history, it is the present. To understand how this network became so vast, you have to trace its roots back to World War II.
When in the creation of, the CIA and the OSS and all of that in World War II. But that alliance officially happened. It's known as Operation Underworld, even though the U.S. intelligence community denied it for several decades. They now admit it. But that alliance, it was justified out of wartime necessity. We have to team up with the mob to win the war, right? But after the war, the alliance provably continued. So ultimately, what happened then is that a lot of these rackets that were previously of organized crime, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, sex trafficking, prostitution, whatever, became, rackets of intelligence services.
In what way?
Well, I mean, there's a litany of evidence of the CIA being involved in drug trafficking and arms trafficking via illegal means. For many decades. And a lot of those networks that the CIA used go back to the same nexus. I mean, that's basically what volume 1 of my...
During the war, U.S. intelligence secretly partnered with powerful mafia figures through a program known as Operation Underworld. American officials wanted help securing ports and gathering intelligence, and organized crime already controlled large parts of the docks and shipping networks, so they made the deal. They brought in Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful mafia bosses in American history, handed him a reduced sentence, and put his network to work. The ports were secured. The mission succeeded. Luciano was eventually deported back to Italy, where he continued running criminal enterprises without interference.
Would they be in bed with these criminals?
It's great business. The CIA in the OSS were really mostly Wall Street people, Wall Street lawyers and bankers, and it was great business for them to team up with these people. So basically, it's a new market. It's a legal market with state protection, and so the CIA more often than not has gone over the competition for those markets, and that's why you have all these scandals, but no accountability for the CIA being involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking. And all sorts of scandals.
But what began as a temporary wartime arrangement opened a door that was never closed again. Intelligence agencies had discovered something they could not unlearn. Criminal networks already had exactly what covert operations required: secret routes, black market contacts, money laundering channels, and influence in places where governments had no reach. Instead of dismantling those networks after the war, intelligence operations began quietly folding them in. Smuggling routes became asset pipelines. Offshore banking became covert funding infrastructure. Black market logistics became the backbone of operations that could never appear in any official budget. And sexual blackmail, a practice intelligence agencies had been refining since the 1950s, became one of the most powerful tools of political control ever developed. These were not side activities. They became core instruments of geopolitical power.
The leader, and then the CIA comes in and deposes them and puts in a dictator. I mean, they've done this around the world.
Over and over.
Over and over again. And I mean, it's not even, they've also interfered in elections throughout Europe. They engaged in things like Operation Gladio, where that was basically teaming up with, the Italian mafia, interests of the Vatican, and the CIA-backed terror groups in Europe. Those terrorist activities were blamed on left-leaning people in order to get people to vote with right-leaning parties to prevent European countries from affiliating themselves with, the Soviet Union. But would they have done that? I don't know. I mean, it was a preemptive thing. And so, I mean, eventually... But I mean, again, this is how the CIA justifies the stuff to itself. I would argue that a lot of it was about economic interests.
That pattern did not stay within American borders. Under a NATO-linked covert program known as Operation Gladio, secret paramilitary networks were embedded across Italy, Belgium, Turkey, and more than a dozen other European countries. On the surface, Gladio was defensive, designed to organize resistance cells in case of Soviet invasion. But investigators in Italy and Belgium later uncovered something far darker. These networks had direct ties to far-right criminal organizations, corrupt politicians, and intelligence operatives who allegedly carried out staged terrorist attacks to shift public opinion and manipulate elections. In Italy, this approach was openly called the strategy of tension. Create chaos, blame political opponents, consolidate control. The 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed 85 civilians, was eventually linked by Italian courts to Gladio-connected networks. State power and organized violence had become the same thing.
So, taking this back to the Epstein scandal, I think that's why they only want to keep the discussion at sex trafficking.
Because it's wider than sex.
Because it's wider than that. Epstein was absolutely doing a lot of really shady arms trafficking stuff and financial criminality, and they have no interest in getting deep in the weeds there.
Because that exposes other people.
Sure. Absolutely. And basically, this illusion that our world operates the way, we're told it operates.
Yeah, but I think we know it doesn't anymore. The veil has been lifted. I think... The only worry is we move on so quickly, we just forget about this Epstein thing, and it's just this thing in the past. Yeah,
it's been pretty persistent in not being forgotten about, which I think now, in the case of the Trump administration, they really wish people would move along and forget about it.
This is the world that produced the modern intelligence crime machine, and once you understand that world, Jeffrey Epstein stops looking like an anomaly and starts looking like a product of a very deliberate system. Epstein did not build his network from scratch. He was recruited into one that already existed, and his mentors tell the entire story. Adnan Khashoggi was a Saudi billionaire arms dealer who brokered weapons deals worth billions between governments, intelligence services, and private military contractors across the Middle East. He was a central figure in the Iran-Contra affair, the scandal where the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran and funneled proceeds to Nicaraguan rebels in direct violation of U.S. law.
Friend of Robert Maxwell, who I'm sure we'll get into later, he was a lawyer, among other things. He testified to Congress in the early 70s about what he saw happening, and he talked about the rise of the trans-ideological corporation, where U.S. multinational corporations were basically entering into all these joint ventures and becoming extremely entangled with state-owned companies of the communist East in Russia and China. And he said that this was creating a new economic system of governance that was making the nation state irrelevant. And this is in the early 70s. And a congressman was like, well, do you think this is a bad thing? And he was like, not necessarily. And he was actually at the forefront of making that happen. And a lot of these people, including people like Robert Maxwell, did try and further that kind of vision. So ultimately, if that was happening at the early 70s and they admitted it, a lot of these actors that justified things out of the necessity of the Cold War, just like they justified it with out of the necessity of World War II, it really doesn't add up with what the public justification.
Robert Maxwell, the British media tycoon who directly launched Epstein's career and introduced him to elite circles, was identified by multiple intelligence sources as an operative working for Mossad. Maxwell died in 1991 in circumstances officially ruled accidental. He fell from his yacht near the Canary Islands at precisely the moment he was facing catastrophic financial exposure and had reportedly become a liability to the people he served. Douglas Leese, another figure in Epstein's orbit, was among the most powerful weapons brokers on the planet. These were the men who shaped Epstein, handed him access, and walked him into rooms that no ordinary financier could ever enter.
Well, it's supposed to be to protect American national security. But national security for a long time has been this huge catch-all,
Yeah,
right?
of course. Yeah, that's
and
what
the
I mean.
U.S. has justified all sorts of things under the guise of national security, and presumably continued to do so. So, I don't really give that a lot of weight. I mean, so as an example, like the Reagan administration, when Iran-Contra was being investigated, there was a line of questioning brought up about how the group that was responsible for that in the Reagan administration had developed something called the continuity of government protocols, whereby under a vaguely defined national emergency, basically the entire American Constitution could be suspended. Pretty scandalous stuff. And one of the examples of this vaguely defined national emergency was a widespread nonviolent opposition to U.S. military intervention abroad. And when a congressman tried to ask Oliver North about this at the Iran-Contra trial, they basically shut down the hearing under the guise of national security.
Through these connections, Epstein gained access to a world where politicians, royalty, intelligence officials, and billionaires played by completely different rules. And the central mechanism holding that world together was kompromat, the practice of obtaining compromising material on powerful individuals and deploying it as permanent leverage. If you can secretly record a senator, a prime minister, or a CEO in a situation that would end their career or put them in prison, you own them. They vote how you want. They sign what you require. They quietly kill investigations before they reach anything important. This is not speculation. This is documented intelligence tradecraft used by multiple agencies across multiple decades, with Epstein's operation functioning as one of its most ambitious modern expressions.
And so Brunel is a lot more connected to Epstein in the sense of the sex trafficking case. So he and Epstein worked together on this modeling agency called MC2, where under the guise of modeling contracts, Brunel would coax a lot of women from places like Brazil, from Eastern Europe, and in Russia, among other places, to come model in the U.S. Epstein would pay for their visas, among other expenses for this agency, and they would come to the U.S. and be housed at these apartment complexes that are there's multiple attestations to that being a key part of the sex trafficking operation. Allegedly, women's passports were taken, so they were, very controllable under those circumstances.
The MC2 Model Management Agency, which Epstein co-founded with Jean-Luc Brunel, served as one of the primary recruitment pipelines feeding that operation. Young women from Eastern Europe, Brazil, and Russia were promised careers in modeling and fashion. Some later alleged they were placed directly into environments controlled by Epstein and his associates. The fashion industry provided the cover story. The promise of opportunity and a better life provided the trap. According to investigators and accusers, this was not a modeling agency that accidentally crossed paths with dangerous people. It was structured to serve the network.
A lot about the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, that implodes in 1991. It's covered up by William Barr when he was Attorney General, who covered up Iran-Contra, the Promise software scandal, and BCCI, all as being Attorney General, and later would return to kind of do that for Trump 1 when he was Attorney General again. But after BCCI implodes, a lot of their portfolio of, organized crime and shady interests goes to the banks of that are sort of related to this guy named Edmund Safra. And Edmund Safra dies in his home, supposedly from, the story is very bizarre, but from arson allegedly set by his American nurse because she wanted to set a fire and then save him from it, but then didn't save him from it. Yeah, it's fine. Anyway, he was very good friends with Robert Maxwell and a lot of these figures that pop up all over the place in the Epstein case. And then who absorbs his banks? HSBC. They basically take those over, and then HSBC gets exposed.
Behind all of it sat the financial infrastructure without which none of this could function at scale. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, known as BCCI, became the most notorious example of what financial complicity inside an intelligence crime network actually looks like. BCCI processes transactions simultaneously for drug cartels, intelligence agencies, weapon smugglers, and corrupt heads of state across 3 continents, operating for years with almost no regulatory interference. When it was finally shut down in 1991, investigators uncovered fraud totaling nearly $20 billion. The financial system absorbed the scandal and continued operating as though nothing had happened, because for the people at the top, nothing had.
It wasn't the Panama Papers, but it was like one of those consortium of journalists that published these leaks, basically revealed a lot of prominent people that were part of these HSBC Swiss accounts that had been inherited from Safra. Epstein was one of them. Some associates of Epstein, like Flavio Briatore, are there. But also, HSBC was laundering money for drug cartels. And who didn't go after them when they were in charge of the Bank of England? Mark Carney, who is now Prime Minister of Canada.
And everyone's leaving.
And while he was head of the Bank of England, there's pictures of him hanging out with Ghislaine. Whose, father Robert Maxwell was banked by Safra, among other things.
The reason this network has survived decades of partial exposure is not that it stays invisible. It is that it is bipartisan. The Epstein scandal did not threaten one political party or one ideological faction. It threatened all of them at once. Documented visitor logs at Epstein's properties included powerful figures from across the entire political spectrum. When a full investigation has the potential to destroy people on every side of the divide simultaneously, the political will to pursue it completely does not exist. Investigations go deep enough to manage public pressure, then quietly stop. Prosecutors offer extraordinary deals. Documents stay sealed for decades. And people who know too much have a documented pattern of dying before they can say anything under oath.
And during that period of time, one of the top people at the CIA that would have been involved in that is this guy named Alan Wade, who was also intimately involved with total information awareness. And if you look at how total information awareness was described, its privacy protections, it's exactly the same as the way Palantir sold their stuff later on. So there's an insane amount of overlap. And what's crazy here is that Alan Wade, a few years prior, had created a Homeland Security software program that was also pre-crime-esque and similar to what Palantir ended up doing. It was called Kiliad, and he teamed up with Christine Maxwell to do that.
The system has not disappeared. It has evolved. What once relied on hidden cameras and physical blackmail has shifted into something far more powerful: mass surveillance. Companies like Palantir, alongside tech giants such as Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, now possess oceans of personal data capable of exposing vulnerabilities on billions of people without a single spy entering a room. Across decades, the names, scandals, and headlines change, but the structure remains: an entrenched network linking intelligence agencies, financial power, corporations, and political elites. The real danger may not be any single scandal, but a vast architecture of influence operating quietly in the background, adapting and expanding every time it is exposed. Which leaves one question hanging over everything: how much of the world we think we understand is actually being shaped by a network most people never see?